started the fight with a partial summon of Rika. This is a really good combo for fighting against the swarms of curses. Hey, what's up everybody? It's LeeLos, and today we're talking about why Yuta versus Kenjaku is obvious. Stay steady in pursuit of your dreams and goals. You're born to win, you're made for greatness, and I definitely believe in you guys. Keep up the great work each and every day. So Yuta versus Kenjaku is a battle between two of some of the absolute strongest characters in Jujutsu Kaisen. Today we're going to analyze every single power-up and ability these two characters display to figure out overall who's more powerful than who between these two characters. So we'll start with the debatably strongest version of Kenjaku and have him fight Culling Game's Yuta. Then we'll work our way up with more and more powerful versions of Yuta to see if anything changes. The debatably most powerful version of Kenjaku would be Kenjaku in Shibuya. This Kenjaku has 10 million curses, and technically, at the start of Shibuya, he would have the prison realm as well. End of series Kenjaku is pretty strong too, because he also has Tengen, and you could argue that if he used Tengen in Uzumaki, he might gain Tengen's immortality curse technique. So, if the Culling Game's Yuta fought the strongest version of Kenjaku, there's a few things to note. First off, if Yuta fought Kenjaku without using Rika, then there's a real possibility that Kenjaku would kill Yuta without ever having to throw a single punch. And for the Yuta fans, just letting you know, we're starting with the weaker form of Yuta first, and then working our way up. Okay, so that's why we're starting with base form Yuta. I'll talk about Yuta with Rika partially manifested and fully manifested in a few moments here. So let's explain why base form Culling Game's Yuta, just using his sword, has a good probability of losing to Kenjaku. Swarms of cursed spirits on their own and zoning Yuta out with Uzumaki would eventually kill this base form version of Yuta who's not using Rika. The reason for this is because Yuta would eventually run out of cursed energy, especially if he's using reverse curse technique output. This was proven during his fight in Sendai Colony. After using reverse curse technique 3 times, one to kill Kuro, another to heal from Kuro's attacks, and a third time to heal from Ryu's Granite Blast, Yuta was already bottoming out on his cursed energy. Reverse curse technique takes a lot of cursed energy to use. He's not someone like Gojo who can spam the technique endlessly and not run out of cursed energy. Even if you double that amount and say that Yuta can use reverse curse technique 6 times, that's simply not enough for base form Yuta to get through Kenjaku's entire swarm of 10 million curses, especially when you consider that just one of Kenjaku's curses, Kururushi, pushed Yuta to the point where he had to use reverse curse technique output. It's not something that Yuta can spam against millions of curses and then kill Kenjaku afterwards. It should also be noted that Yuta fought a nerfed version of Kururushi. Kururushi was starving, and the more he eats, the more roaches he can create. So imagine a full power Kururushi doing combo attacks with swarms of other cursed spirits from Kenjaku while Kenjaku's blasting Uzumakis from the sky. Yuta is eventually going to run out of cursed energy here and lose to Kenjaku. So now let's talk about what would happen if Culling Game's Yuta started the fight with a partial summon of Rika. This would be a much better situation for Yuta and a much smarter strategy for fighting Kenjaku, because partial manifestation Rika also has reverse curse technique output, and Rika has essentially infinite cursed energy. So this is a really good combo for fighting against the swarms of curses. Anytime that Yuta's in trouble, Rika can save him with reverse curse technique output, and Yuta can save his cursed energy for getting up close and fighting Kenjaku. If Yuta then uses Rika's 5-minute mode, a possible win condition for Yuta would be to use Cursed Speech, freeze Kenjaku in place, and then chop his head off. But to be completely fair, this very likely would not work on Kenjaku because Kenjaku has Geto's memories. He knows that Yuta has Cursed Speech, and it's stated that Cursed Speech isn't that challenging to defend against when you know that the attack's coming. You simply defend your ears with Cursed Energy, and it doesn't work on you. The odds of Kenjaku falling for this attack when he has Geto's memories and knows that Yuta can do this is pretty unlikely. Kenjaku is simply way too skilled to fall for something like that. So it's a possible win condition for Yuta, but it's not a very likely one. So then the question becomes, Games, is Culling Game's Yuta fast enough to blitz Kenjaku and chop his head off? So Kenjaku actually has some really insane reaction speed feats. He was able to react to Yuki's black hole attack and activate his curse technique before being crushed by the black hole, which is honestly really crazy. But a better scene for comparing him to Yuta is actually during the scene where Yuta chops Kenjaku's head off. This is a post-training arc Yuta, who's considerably stronger now. Sukuna states that his cursed energy reinforcement has improved drastically, and it's implied that cursed energy reinforcement would augment speed as well. I've spoken about this in other videos, but a quick summary of the concept we see in JJK 0, Geto pretty much says this. When we see Yuta surge with cursed energy in JJK 0, Kenjaku states his speed has increased, which implies that either cursed energy reinforcement or cursed energy output augments speed. And then the other example that implies that cursed energy reinforcement increases speed is Yuta being able to keep up in running speed with Yuji, because Yuji is superhuman and stronger than he'd ever been before. Meanwhile, Yuta is stated to be on the weaker side without cursed energy, but he makes up for the stat difference by augmenting himself with his cursed energy pool and cursed energy reinforcement. Without cursed energy, Yuta would not be that fast or strong, but using his cursed energy and reinforcing his body with it, he becomes fast enough to keep up with a superhuman like Yuji. That's a long way of saying Yuta is stronger and very likely faster than ever as well, and he sneak attacks Kenjaku while Kenjaku's off guard, and Kenjaku still reacts to him. Before Kenjaku activates his curse technique, then Todo uses his curse technique again, and Yuta's able to chop Kenjaku's head off. This implies that bare minimum, Kenjaku is relative in reaction speed to this stronger and faster than ever version of Yuta. This is also backed up by Todo saying that it would have been tough for even Yuta to perform this sneak attack without his help. A highball interpretation is that this version of Kenjaku is actually faster than Yuta and would have landed his attack without Todo's help, but a more low to medium ball interpretation is to just say that he's relative to this stronger and faster than ever version of Yuta. Something else that's worth noting is that there's a real argument that this version of Kenjaku isn't even at full power. That's because he just finished a battle with Takaba in which he was taking damage, and we know that damage lowers output. He would be at least a small percentage nerfed from the damage he had taken and the cursed energy he used in his battle against Takaba. But on top of this, an underrated potential nerf to Kenjaku's power is actually maintaining the Culling Games. He's performing all of these feats while maintaining the Culling Games. So there's a low, medium, and high ball interpretation as to how much the Culling Games could actually be nerfing Kenjaku. The low ball interpretation is that it's no noticeable nerf of any kind, or just such a small amount that it barely matters. But there's arguments that the Culling Games might actually be having a noticeable effect on Kenjaku's power. That's because there's 10 massive barriers around the colonies in the Culling Games that are maintained throughout the entirety of the arc. When talking about the Sendai colony barrier, Kenjaku states that he created the barrier and it's 5,000 to 6,000 meters in radius. That is an absolutely insane barrier feat, especially when you consider that Sukuna's domain expansion, for example, has a radius of 200 meters. This isn't Kenjaku's domain range, but it's still a very insane barrier technique to have a barrier thousands of meters in radius, have multiple rules put into these barriers, and then have 10 of these things and have it maintained for an entire arc. So the more highball interpretation is that Kenjaku is creating these barriers with his own cursed energy and maintaining them the entire arc while he's fighting all these other people, and the cursed energy required to keep these barriers active is nerfing Kenjaku in some way. The more low to medium ball interpretation is that Kenjaku didn't actually create these barriers, he was simply modifying the pure barriers that Tengen had already created. This is based on dialogue from Kenjaku in which he says that he created Brahmin barriers for the Culling Games that are based on Tengen's pure barriers. So it's honestly a debatable thing which interpretation you think is the more correct interpretation. It's either Kenjaku just modified the pure barriers, or Kenjaku is more or less using Tengen's pure barriers as a model or inspiration and created his own barriers himself with his own cursed energy. That That's the difference between the low and the more highball interpretation. Whenever Tengen is referring to these barriers, she calls them the game barriers, and she says that the game barriers reject her. It's kind of interesting how they actually reject Tengen. You wouldn't really expect that if they were just modified versions of her own barriers, but maybe these are just the pure barriers that Tengen created. Kenjaku modified them and then threw in a binding vow that they reject Tengen at the same time. Whether you take the low ball interpretation or the high ball interpretation, Kenjaku is partially nerfed. And even when he's off guard, he's still able to react to a stronger and faster than ever version of Yuta. A low to medium ball interpretation is that Kenjaku is relative in reaction and combat speed to the faster and stronger than ever version of Shinjuku Yuta. And the high ball interpretation is that he's actually faster than this Shinjuku Yuta. And you could argue that that's backed up by Todo saying without his help, it would have been hard for Yuta to do a surprise attack on Kenjaku. So all that being said, considering that Kenjaku is relative to a faster version of Yuta at bare minimum, the reality is Culling Game's Yuta, a slower and weaker version of Yuta, is not fast enough to just blitz and chop the strongest version of Kenjaku's head off. So Culling Game's Yuta, who starts the fight with a partially manifested version of Rika, this battle would likely come down to a domain clash. Even if you lowball Kenjaku, they'd be relative enough in speed that they can hold their own with each other. Honestly, a more medium ball interpretation is that Kenjaku would simply be faster than the Culling Game's Yuta. Let's just be fair to Yuta here and say they're relative. The winner of the fight would very likely be determined through a domain battle. In this case, Kenjaku is pretty much guaranteed to win against Culling Game's Yuta. His barrier techniques with his domain are not strong enough to match the barrier techniques of Kenjaku, someone who's stated to be the second strongest in barrier techniques in the entire series. This implies that his barrier techniques might be better than even Sukuna's. In a domain clash, there's a few notable variables that we've seen that determine who wins or has an advantage in a domain clash. Gojo states the more refined domain will win, and then he also states that cursed energy plays a factor. Analyzing the Gojo versus Sukuna fight, we see that barrier techniques also play a factor, because Gojo and Sukuna, they essentially evened out in terms of refinement and cursed energy, but Sukuna had the superior barrier techniques and was able to break Gojo's domain, because Sukuna had an open barrier domain with a wider range, meanwhile Gojo just had a closed barrier domain. Comparing Culling Game's Yuta to Kenjaku in a domain battle, the reality is Kenjaku's barrier techniques are on a different level than Yuta's. We don't get too much detail on what refinement specifically means. You could argue that it's connected to cursed energy control, or maybe it's related to barrier techniques in some way. Who would have better refinement with their domain between Culling Game's Yuta and Kenjaku? But just being honest, when it comes to skill, Kenjaku kind of outclasses Yuta. He's 1,000 years old. He has way more jujutsu experience. I'm just gonna be honest, way more likely that Kenjaku's refinement's better than Yuta's. But then when it comes down to cursed energy, Yuta would have the advantage there. Debatable over whether he means cursed energy capacity or cursed energy output or a combination of both. If it's cursed energy capacity, then yeah, Yuta has the advantage. But if it's output, then it's debatable, because Ryu says that Yuta's output isn't that insane, it's more his capacity that's insane. So there's a lot of factors to consider here, but overall, Kenjaku is considerably more likely to win a domain clash against Yuta. What's most likely to happen is that Kenjaku will break Yuta's domain from the outside, and even if Yuta has simple domain, he's simply going to die in Kenjaku's domain expansion. All that being said, it's simply more likely that the strongest version of Kenjaku would defeat Culling Game's Yuta. So now let's talk about the Shinjuku Yuta and talk about how would he do against Kenjaku. Yuta actually has very real possible win conditions. His best one is genuinely Jacob's Ladder. Might just hard counter Kenjaku. In theory, if this hits Kenjaku, it might just turn off his body swap technique and Kenjaku would just hit the ground and lose immediately. We never see anyone in the series dodge this technique, not even Sukuna. Kenjaku has multiple curse techniques, the body swap technique, the gravity technique, and he has curse spirit manipulation. There's a real possibility that Jacob's Ladder would just turn off one of his 3 curse techniques. If that's what happens, then it's a 1 out of 3 chance that it simply doesn't work. that it just turns off Curse Spirit manipulation for a second and Kenjaku's fine. So that's another possibility. A third possibility is that Yuta's Jacob's Ladder is simply too weak to properly extinguish a curse technique. Because we see Jacob's Ladder used multiple times throughout the story, and it just kinda never does what you think it's going to do. There's an argument that Yuta, even using Jacob's Ladder at his best, might be on par with this weakened version of Jacob's Ladder from Hana. Yuta might not be as good at using Jacob's Ladder as Hana is, which is implied by him struggling to use Curse Speech at first. Even after having Curse Speech for a while, he still didn't know all of the details about it. It might just hurt Kenjaku a bit, but not actually extinguish his body swap technique. These are all possibilities. If his Jacob's Ladder does extinguish Kenjaku's body swap technique, then yeah, Yuta can actually hard counter one-shot Kenjaku. And in that instance, I would say that Yuta would be slightly more likely to win, at least outside of a domain battle. However, if Jacob's Ladder fits the category of the other two options, it just has a 1/3 chance of taking away his body swap technique, or it's just not strong enough to actually extinguish Kenjaku's technique, then there's a lot of other possibilities in this fight. It's going to come down to a domain battle again. Now this time it's different because Yuta has improved his barrier skills, and this is where the fight gets very interesting. You can make the argument that now Yuta has basketball domain, and Gojo using basketball domain was able to withstand Sukuna's domain expansion for 3 full minutes while fighting inside of the domain. As we all know, Yuta's not as strong as Gojo, but Kenjaku's not as strong as Sukuna. So maybe their domain clash would have a similar effect. Maybe it would also take 3 full minutes for Kenjaku to break Yuta's domain from the outside if Yuta uses basketball domain. There's an argument that Yuta, when he's outside of Gojo's body, actually doesn't have basketball domain. The argument is that the only reason Yuta could use basketball domain was because he was using Gojo's body with Gojo's memories and the Six Eyes. The Six Eyes, which improve his cursed energy control drastically. There's a real possibility of that. There is a real chance that Yuta in his actual body can't use basketball domain. So if Yuta does not have basketball domain, then yeah, it's more likely that Kenjaku would win in a domain clash. His open barrier domain is just going to break Yuta's domain on the outside, and then Yuta's going to be left with just simple domain to defend himself, and Kenjaku's going to destroy his simple domain and then fry Yuta. But if Yuta can use basketball domain, then the fight becomes very close. If we assume that Yuta's able to maintain basketball domain for 3 minutes against Kenjaku's open barrier domain, attacking it from the outside, then Yuta has 3 minutes to damage Kenjaku enough to break his domain. Meanwhile, Kenjaku has to survive for 3 minutes while Yuta's attacking him on the inside. So an interesting question becomes, can he use Curse Spirit manipulation inside of his domain expansion at the same time, essentially using 2 curse techniques while he's inside of the domain? We see that Sukuna is able to do that. He's able to use Maharaga and the sure hit effect of Shrine at the same time while inside of his domain expansion. He's able to use 2 techniques at the same time. So there's a real possibility that Kenjaku can do the same thing. To be honest, I lean towards thinking that Kenjaku actually can do that, because we see him doing things with Jujutsu sorcery that even Sukuna never do. For example, when he's in curse technique burnout, he still just uses a curse technique anyway. He still maintains his body swap technique, which is, it's actually just breaking the rules of sorcery, which is kind of crazy. So I lean towards thinking that he actually can use Curse Spirit manipulation inside of his domain expansion, and in that case, it becomes a really close fight. It's more of a 50-50. If he lands Jacob's Ladder on him inside of the domain, he wins. If he's locked in doing crazy combos with Rika, he does have a chance to actually damage this guy enough to break his domain in 3 minutes. It could really go either way, but if Kenjaku cannot use Curse Spirit manipulation inside of the domain, then Yuta is more likely to win. The gravity technique has a cooldown interval, so all they would have to do, have one of them get slammed by the gravity technique, right? Then in the cooldown interval, Yuta can damage him, and they could just keep doing combos like that until they damage Kenjaku enough to to break his domain. The Yuta in Shinjuku versus Kenjaku is a very competitive battle. The reality is they both have valid win conditions on each other, depending on how you think their abilities would clash with each other. Outside of a domain, Yuta would be slightly more likely to win with Jacob's Ladder, but if Jacob's Ladder doesn't one-shot Kenjaku and Yuta doesn't have basketball domain, then Kenjaku would be more likely to win. But if Jacob's Ladder doesn't one-shot Kenjaku and Yuta does have basketball domain, then the fight genuinely becomes a 50-50 inside of the domain battle, as long as Kenjaku can use Curse Spirit Manipulation. But again, if Kenjaku cannot use Curse Spirit Manipulation within the domain battle, then Yuta would again be more likely to win. And then if you want to talk about adult Yuta and JJK Modulo, yeah, he probably like low diffs Kenjaku. If you highball him, you can get some really crazy scaling for him. Like for example, they were saying that ring, he was pouring his cursed energy into it like over decades, right? Over many years. And we know that Yuta had like half as much cursed energy as Sukuna. So like if you really wanted to highball Yuta, you could say like, look, if he just pours all of his cursed energy into that ring for a week, he would have like two or three Sukunas worth of energy in that ring. That's just like a week of all of his cursed energy going into it for a week, right? And he was pouring his cursed energy into it steadily over years. So like that ring, it probably had a lot more cursed energy than Sukuna. So yeah, the Modulo old man Yuta could like, he would destroy Kenjaku, okay? But yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to say there. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate the views in the comments. Like and subscribe, and I'll see ya on the next one.